When will the war end? How many resources does Russia have to keep up the massive invasion against Ukraine? Will the Kremlin use nuclear, chemical, or any other weapons of mass destruction? If yes, how will the West respond? Will Putin get away with this? Or no? For instance, Ukraine is now receiving unprecedented support, military, political, and diplomatic. The sanctions imposed on the Kremlin are a lot heavier than the ones imposed on North Korea, say. But still, dozens of thousands of people have been killed in Mariupol. Ukrainian city of Kherson has been occupied by the Russian military, and the rest of the Ukrainian cities cannot afford night's sleep due to permanent air alerts and missile strikes. Can other states possibly be on Russia's death list? Moldova, Georgia, Poland, or the Baltic countries? How will the free world react to the possible further Russia's atrocities? All of these questions we have discussed with a US expert who professionally analyzes global processes, who knows how wars end, and who is aware of how efficient international organizations are. Please meet Director of the Center for Political and Military Analysis at Hudson Institute, Richard Weitz. Thank you very much for agreeing to meet online and speak about the war unfolding in Ukraine. On February the 9th, you published an analytical article, analytical comments on the possible scenarios that Russia could play in Ukraine. What do you think now? How true they were, the scenarios you described?
Well, they chose the worst of the possible options. So it was, there was one option was they would try and exploit the buildup to gain concessions with Ukraine regarding Minsk and other issues. Another was they were trying to gain concessions from the West on the European security treaties they proposed and other matters. There was a possible scenario with a limited intervention in the Donbass to fortify the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. But then there were two really expansive scenarios. One was to weaken NATO by attacking Ukraine, which would be a major effort. But even more, there was one in which they would attack Ukraine in order to weaken its armed forces. This might fall on the rubric of demilitarization in the President Putin's framework. And the rationale here was Ukrainian military was growing increasingly and stronger, so they would launch a preventive war to weaken it decisively and keep Ukraine at their mercy for renewed attack. But the worst of the scenarios was just what we're seeing now, was an all-out invasion designed to take over the entire country, replace its government, and basically absorb it one way or another as a union republic into Belarus or Russia, or actually just part of Russian territory, or somehow just bring the whole territory under their control. And that was the most extreme scenario, the most worrisome, but seemed to be not unlikely. But like many things, I got this one wrong.
How successful have they been so far? I mean, they chose to try and invade the whole and take control of the whole country. How would you evaluate their success?
Well, so far they've had three phases, in my view. The first two failed. First one failed completely. The second one failed mostly. Now we're in this third phase. So the first phase was they seemed to believe their own propaganda that the Ukrainian government was weak and didn't have popular support and was a puppet of the West. So if you just send in some paratroops, seize the leaders, you could basically take over the entire country without much resistance. So we saw them make a show of force with some missile strikes, some displays of air and power. But the key operation appeared to have been the dropping of the paratroops into airports near Kiev and other places, and with the expectation they would just use these as bridgeheads to bring in more supplies and go off and seize the government, the key ministries, and then be able to withdraw with some kind of puppet government that would take over the running of the country, like you've seen in Soviet times, and that just failed completely. They overestimated their own capabilities. They underestimated the effectiveness of the Ukrainian defenses. They then also underestimated the inclination, determination of the Ukrainian people to resist. So they lost a lot of the paratroops because they weren't supported by, they were basically, it was just a bridge too far, and they were overextended, didn't have adequate support. So that collapsed in about 48 hours. So then they went to phase two, which was this massive multi-axis invasion launched from the north, east, and 1 to 3 axes in the south, depending on how you count them. And that made some territorial gains, particularly around Crimea, some lesser ones in the east, and in the north, it made some initial gains, but basically it culminated very quickly. They overextended the supply lines, they spread themselves too thin, and they all just bogged down. And so now we're seeing phase three, which was withdrawal from the north, and continuing the offensive in the south, but really focusing the main effort in the east to try and seize the rest of the Donbass. And this one, don't know. It's these are different phases, so maybe just because they failed in the first two doesn't mean they'll fail in the third, but they've got some major challenges to overcome.
Putin and his military officials are saying that the so-called military operation, as they call it, only has 2 phases, and now is the second.
Right. They don't want to admit the first one, which, I mean, I don't. Maybe they didn't consider it a military; they just considered it a takeover. They expected a peaceful takeover, so you had National Guard units driving through the country unescorted, as if they were in Russia itself, not anticipating they would face any resistance. But I count them as this is phase three.
This phase three, considering the losses that Russia is having here in Ukraine, how much longer can they keep this operation rolling? Have they got enough resources?
Well, it depends on the intensity, depends on the resistance they face. I would think they could go for fight for a month, maybe. And then they have to make some tough decisions about, do they use the conscripts that they're going to call up? Are they comfortable depleting all the other fronts to focus so much of their power in the west of Russia, when they might get bogged down in a stalemate? So I think at that point they'd have to settle back for some kind of positional warfare, less intense effort, maybe negotiate a settlement. But if they make progress and they break in and they seize the Donbass and have a lot of momentum, then I expect they'll try and continue. As we heard yesterday, some are even contemplating going as far as Moldova to link up with Transnistria.
Now they are claiming that they want the territory from Mariupol, the stripe from Mariupol to Transnistria. How likely is that? How easy is that implemented, considering all the Ukrainian forces that are trying to fight back?
Right. Yeah. So what they want and what they'll get, as your question implies, is probably going to be very different. So sure, they'd like to take over. If they can't have all of Ukraine, maybe they can have the southern part of Ukraine. And that would cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea, link up to Moldova, and so on. But it seems unlikely, given that they've made limited progress in the south in the past month. And in fact, you've seen Ukrainian forces launch some successful counterattacks. And the main focus now is in the east. So I do not see that scenario developing soon, barring a collapse in the Ukrainian resistance. I think it's that may have been the original war aim, or as one of them. if they couldn't conquer all of Ukraine. But I think at this point, that is beyond their reach.
How crucial was it for Moscow and for the Russian military forces when the Ukrainians drowned the Moskva, the warship?
Right. So that ship was of course, intense symbolic importance. It was a flagship. It was the ship that confronted the brave defenders on Snake Island. It was something that the Russians would always like to show off to visitors and to the Black Sea. And it had some military importance for air defense of some of the missile launching ships. It was not itself launching missiles in the caliber missiles into Ukraine. That's done by some other ships. And so the thinking, though, is important in that it shows that the Ukrainians have now been able to engage in anti-ship missile strikes. Before, they were very effective with the anti-air and the anti-armor ground. Now we can see they actually have an anti-ship capacity. It's gonna it exposes certain weaknesses for all about the ship's defenses. I think that people are going to wonder why, with 3 layers of defenses, it wasn't able to intercept the missiles. It certainly has led the remaining Russian ships to go back from the coast somewhat. That means when they launch missile strikes into Ukraine from farther out, it means the Ukrainians will have more time to respond, try and intercept the missiles, try and get out of the way or go get underground. So it's going to have some impact. But that said, the main battle is on land at the moment, and it's really a question of what happens in the Donbass region with the ground forces supported by some air, and the naval component is not as important.
How likely that they still gonna use their paratroopers that they have on board of those ships still remaining in the Black Sea? I mean, are they likely to attack Odessa or?
Right. So yeah, the Marines on that they have available, an amphibious operation was considered somewhat unlikely just because it's so difficult. The last successful one occurred in 1950 when in the U.S. And General MacArthur and Incheon and managing to get around the Chinese and the North Korean forces by surprising them. But since then, nobody's really tried it against a determined resistance because it's just really difficult. And so we weren't sure if it seemed that they were making the feint of threatening such an amphibious operation just to keep the Ukrainian forces tied down there. But as far as I can tell, they've actually deployed most of the Marines on shore, and they're now fighting in the Battle of Mariupol, and as additional infantry forces.
In this war, Ukraine has mostly relied on the West. I mean, getting all this support and financial and military support. How effective has that been?
So it's critical in several respects. One, the Ukrainian stockpiles of weapons was just inherently limited, and so they needed to have the ammunition replaced. They needed to have spare parts. They needed to have other types of assistance. And there's certainly, I think, we don't know the full details, but I think the West has been helping them with some intelligence sharing, understanding where the Russians are, where they're going, who's being killed, what to target. And the sanctions will have impacts in the long run. And diplomatically, you've seen an unexpected show of solidarity. It was more than I thought. As you recall, you mentioned my initial piece, and one of the scenarios was NATO would split over how to respond to a limited Russian incursion. But since they've gone for this massive one, this hasn't been much of an issue. There's strong NATO, EU, Western support. That said, it hasn't included some of the things that the Ukrainian forces would have liked, the no-fly zone. President Biden very early took off the table the possibility of U.S. forces intervening in the conflict, and that may have made it easier for the Russians in the sense that they felt more comfortable taking these very aggressive war aims, engaging a lot of war crimes and so on. But it was realistic. I mean, I think that it would have, I don't think the US or any NATO country was going to send their forces into Ukraine as long as the fighting stayed in Ukraine.
I mean, we'll get back to the no-fly zone and the possibility of the United States or other countries getting involved in this conflict. But so far, I would like to ask you. I mean, Ukraine has been receiving a lot of different types of weapons, but still, it obviously needs a lot more, including counteroffensive operations. How likely is it that Zelensky will get those from Western allies?
So you are correct so far that the West has given the Ukrainian armed forces important weapons for defense. Particularly, we talked about the thousands of missiles and armor and intelligence, and the Ukrainians certainly are capable of launching limited counteroffensives. We've seen this occur in the north and in the south, but for the big counteroffensive, which we would like to see, reconquering the Donbass, if not Crimea, the Ukrainians will need a lot more. They're going to need a lot more air power. They're going to need a lot better integration, command, intelligence, surveillance. So they'll need either many more warplanes or thousands of drones. They're going to need a lot more armor. And that hasn't come, and therefore they haven't been able to engage in the kind of counteroffensive they might like. It may come, it may take a while. You probably, since there's only a limited stockpile of these Soviet era arms lying around in NATO countries, they're going to need to buy more from other places, or they'll need to train the Ukrainians how to use some of the Western weapons, and that will take months. I mean, they'd have to learn how to use a new system effectively, how to integrate with their other systems. So that may become more important towards the end of the year or next year, if and I hope it doesn't, this war continues that long.
But how likely that the war ends? How Ukraine wishes? I mean, earlier than that.
Well, I mean, it'll probably require a change of government in Russia to create the conditions for a Russian withdrawal. That happened, it happened in 1990, and that got freedom for Ukraine originally and for the Baltic states. It may happen, but who knows? I just that whole what's going on inside the Kremlin, what kind of resistance President Putin is facing, with whom, it's impossible to tell from out here. So barring that, I think the Ukrainians, unless the Russians make some serious mistakes, will be able to launch some limited counterattacks. But what we'd like to see is a repeat of the Battle of Kursk, for example, with the Russians playing the role of the Nazis. They launch their offensive, and then the Ukrainians are able to block the offensive and counterattack and defeat the Russian armor and the offensive potential of the Russian armed forces. But it's just difficult given the limited amount of Ukrainian heavy equipment. They have enough troops. The troop numbers appear to be closely matched, but the Ukrainians just need a lot more armor and air power to engage in the offensive we saw the Soviets engage in, or the Israelis counteroffensive.
Ukraine has been pleading with the West and with NATO to close the sky, to provide this no-fly zone, and the West has been clear they are not getting involved. On a daily basis, we hear all the airstrike alerts, the sirens never shut up. Probably there is something unconventional that could help. Do you see a way?
Well, I think where we're going seems to be working somewhat, which is Ukrainian armed forces rely on asymmetrical means of attacking, of defeating the platforms that are launching these strikes. So we've seen the Ukrainians use anti-air missiles to basically deny Russian planes and helicopters freedom to maneuver over Ukrainian airspace. So what's happening now is they're basically staying over Russian airspace and launching missiles into Ukraine. The ships, as we mentioned, are moving back and launching for farther out. So this, in a way, Ukraine itself has closed the skies to manned overflights of Russian airplanes, except at night or when they fly, if they try and fly very low, and which makes them vulnerable to man-pad systems. To have the capacity to shoot down the planes over Russian airspace, NATO has so far been reluctant to do that, to help Ukraine do that, but they may have to revise that approach if this continues.
According to the official reports, the Ukrainian army downed over 150 Russian air jets, I mean, like fighter jets, and also 150 helicopters, more than that. So 300 air units, if I can call them that. How bad is that for the Russian army? I mean, how big a loss is that?
Well, it's deprived them of air superiority. I think we've seen the Ukrainian defenses be able to deny Russia freedom to control the skies. So they haven't been able to fly. They haven't been successful at suppressing the enemy air defenses, as it's known in the field. They've had to basically engage with Ukrainian warplanes and missiles continuously, and that's prevented them from having the kind of air dominance that the Israelis or the Americans and others enjoyed in other conflicts. And I think that's hurting them on the ground. What we don't quite know is how the drones were playing out, or how effective they are as substitutes for air systems, crewed air systems. But I think the Ukrainians have done very well with what they've had.
Speaking of the discussions that are going on inside NATO, inside the European Union, and probably on the Capitol Hill as well, how united are the Western countries in this resistance?
More united than I thought. So particularly, I think there's a strong support for providing Ukraine with diplomatic support, sanctions, military assistance, financial support. So better than I would have anticipated based on the squabbles the alliance has had over Ukraine and other issues in the past. There are some countries that maybe are less enthusiastic than others. Hungary comes to mind, but they aren't being so obnoxious as to confront the NATO consensus, the EU consensus. So I think that's been one of the pleasant results of this whole situation, is the strong support we're seeing given to Ukraine by the allies.
Well, here in Ukraine, still many people criticize, namely Germany and France. Does that mean that there are still a lot of contradictions going on inside the EU?
I think they've been exaggerated. I mean, even though the Germans aren't doing some things, such as providing the heavy weapons that maybe it's contested topic in the coalition, they're still not interfering with other countries doing so. I mean, what we feared was there would be disputes within the allies that would render NATO inoperable, and so the U.S. as an effective means of countering the invasion. So the U.S. would have to work with Britain and others and cobble together a sort of a coalition of the willing to do this. But so far, some countries have been, if they're holding back, they're not holding back others. They're just staying back themselves. And I give some credit for the Germans in terms of reversing a lot of their historical reluctance to confront Russia in general. And, it's not as much as we would have liked, but I think it's more than we thought we'd get.
Speaking of the whole European Union, I mean, something unprecedented happened when Ukraine managed to apply for EU membership. I mean, it was a shortened procedure. They cut off their red tape and let Ukraine apply. How likely do you think it is that Ukraine could be accepted by the EU countries as a new member?
Right. This would be best as discussed by someone who knows more about the EU than I do. Being in the US, it's really hard to understand the EU. It's even more complicated than the US political system if you take it as a collective entity. My impression always was it was very reluctant for them to bring in controversial countries like Ukraine, Georgia, even Turkey. But maybe situations change. But I really just don't know enough about EU internal dynamics to give an assured answer on this question.
But do you think that could change the course of this, the character of this war, if Ukraine suddenly became an EU member?
No, I mean, I think it would help a lot with the recovery. I mean, Ukraine's going to have to need a lot of help to to restore its economy and we're going to need to give educational opportunities to young Ukrainians in Europe and so on. So I think it could help a lot in accelerating Ukraine's recovery after it wins or whatever happens to this current conflict. But in terms of influencing the conflict itself, no, not so much. Maybe NATO, if Ukraine were been into NATO, that would have a decisive impact. But more in the future again. I think this conflict, it's going to be decided not so much by the sanctions or the membership offers to Ukraine or things like that. It's really going to be settled by Ukraine winning or stalemating the Russian invasion forces on the ground and forcing a compromise.
Speaking about the possibility of other countries getting involved into this war, we have heard and we do know that the United States have been clear, and the European Union and NATO, they all have been clear that they are not going to interfere. But if, say, Russia used any kind of weapons of mass destruction, say chemical weapons or biological weapons or nuclear weapons, would that change the position of the United States, namely?
Well, I guess it depends on chemicals, or it depends on what kind. Do they use chlorine, and then they can, there'd be a fight over, well, maybe it was an industrial accident. We saw that in Mariupol when we saw a couple people have symptoms that could have been related to chemicals. So you got people saying, well, it's a big industrial plant. Maybe they were released from inadvertently from the attack on a storage facility. So anything that's not massive, no, won't change it. But if we have evidence of nerve gas, you see thousands of Ukrainian civilians dying or being flushed into the cities, that should change. I don't know if it would bring about Western intervention, and President Biden made comments to imply that it wouldn't be a military response that way. It would be some other kind of response that the U.S. and the allies would pursue. But it just really depends on what happens, how sure we are it was deliberate, and the casualties and so on.
But how about the nukes?
Yeah, well, that would be a big game changer. The Russians would use the nukes to frighten the West not to intervene, I would think. I mean, there's no military reason why they would need to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine directly if they plan to occupy the whole country or at least take advantage of its resources. So if they use it, it would be more to warn the West or influence Western decision making. And then that would be a big question. What does the West do? It depends on where the nuke was used, and does the U.S. respond with a nuclear weapon? Does it respond some other way? There's a group in the government that's gaming all these scenarios out, and so they probably got a playbook for how to do this. But it really just depends a lot on the scenario and where and what was used. But I tend to think it unlikely, as long as NATO stays out of the war, that the Russians would use a nuclear weapon, even if they're stalemated. It just seems like a bridge too far. But again, I and everybody else here have been wrong about judging what President Putin will do and why he does it. So I'm glad there are some people looking at this scenario.
I mean, we've heard the rhetoric that Vladimir Putin voiced numerously, that there are foreign soldiers, foreign boots on the ground here in Ukraine, foreign insurgents. That's something he has been saying repeatedly. Does that mean that he is also considering this option?
No, I mean, the way it's been thought of is not foreign insurgents or advisors or weapons, but like if NATO were to send its forces into Ukraine to do battle with the Russian invaders, then that would present them with targets with political rationale. Can they think they can frighten the West into backing off? Or if there was a conflict that broke out for some other reasons in the Baltic states or with Poland, perhaps through escalation from conventional battle, then these kind of scenarios come into play. But so far, they've seemed to get a de facto kind of fire breaks, if you will, that the U.S. and the other allies are providing a lot of military assistance to Ukraine, but not putting their own forces, their regular forces, to the country. And so Russia is attacking the Ukrainians and the assistance they're getting, but not NATO countries or territory.
Russia's economy has been shrinking due to the sanctions imposed by the Western countries. And obviously, it looks like now Russia is trying to ally with China. How strong that kind of union could be, and would that change anything on the continent?
Yeah, that's been a disappointment about how solid, and this is not new. Seen this last few years, how strong the China-Russia alignment is. So China is providing important diplomatic cover, joining and echoing and reinforcing Russia propaganda, and that's been influencing opinion in the non-Western world about what's happening. China has continued to its economic dealings with Russia in many areas, but it's not clear that they provided direct military assistance. So I think that's what the Russians would like, in the sense of getting replacement drones and parts and Chinese tech and so on. So this is going to make it harder to get the Russians to back down because of the coverage they're getting from China. I would say, though, there was one good thing the Chinese did, that was by insisting that the invasion not take place during the Beijing Olympics. They managed to push it off into a time when the ground was thawing, and so you get these massive Russian convoys of trucks and tanks and so on stuck in the mud. So that was probably the only good thing the Chinese have done for the war inadvertently, and that they pushed off the Russian timing into a less opportune moment to wage a kind of a war that they like to do with mass armors and so on.
There are territorial disputes between Russia and China. Could China use the situation that a lot of defense units, Russian defense units, are now involved in Ukraine? Could they take that opportunity and seize that land?
I do not see that. I don't, I think that's why the Russians felt comfortable pulling all their forces out, because they didn't think the Chinese would interfere. So they actually did, as you said, deplete a lot of their forces from there, apparently taking them out of Georgia and Syria and elsewhere. So and the Chinese, they have really no incentive to confront Russia in general. I mean, their relationship with everybody else, it's like Russia's is so bad, right? So they're bad with India, with the US, Australia, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, so on. Why would they confront the last country around them that's not actively making their life difficult? Same with the Russians, their relationship with everybody's so bad. Why would they needlessly antagonize this? So the Chinese were been pretty open about saying to the US, okay, what you want is you want us to break our relationship with our one friend now so that you can concentrate on attacking us later. And so they're just not going to do that, anything to antagonize the Russians, such as seize their territory or cut off economic and other ties with Russia.
Talking about this, passage from Mariupol to Transnistria, there was something that sounded very, very odd to me from the Kremlin, and that was a statement by Vladimir Putin, who said that Moldova might be next. How likely is that, and what will the reaction of the West be if they attack Moldova as well?
Right. So if the Russians succeed in taking over southern Ukraine or all of Ukraine, they probably, then they will then try and expand. I think President Zelensky is right, to other countries at some point, and they may take a pause for a few months or years to consolidate their control and reinforce their potential. But I think that if that were to occur, then the targets I would worry about would be Georgia and Moldova above all, but there might be others too that they're going to try and influence. And the Western response will be the same as it is with Ukraine. There'll be a lot of economic support, diplomatic support, maybe even military assistance, but not Western military intervention. President Biden's been pretty direct about saying, if you're in NATO, the US will defend you with whatever it can. If you're not, then the US, like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Ukraine, then the US will provide you with substantial help, but not to use its own forces to defend you, which I think the Finns and the Swedes have learned this lesson, and that's why they decided that their previous policy, which brought some benefits to them, of working closely with NATO but not being a member.
Does that mean that this war that's unfolding in Ukraine right now, and obviously it's not going to end very quickly, does that mean that the door is no more open, the NATO door, for Ukraine?
I don't think they'll let NATO in, the Ukraine in during the active phase of the conflict, but I think that Ukrainian forces have shown that they're certainly up to NATO standards in terms of their military capability, the importance of keeping Ukraine out of Russian control, in terms of the security of all of Europe. As long as Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia are free, that helps weaken the potential Russia to threaten other countries. So I think that if anything, this has strengthened the argument for Ukraine's entry into NATO at some point. The best time to do that, of course, is when Russia is weak, and not threatening. So we might have to wait a bit for that benign situation to reoccur. But I think that's the long-term solution to this problem, bringing Ukraine into NATO.
Today, the world history is being written in Ukraine. Something we haven't seen before when a small nation, using the power of its own people, is fighting to defend the security of a whole continent, but on its own battlefield. When a huge nuclear state is facing unexpected resilience, because the Ukrainians have nowhere to retreat to, because it is their home under attack, they have to fight for their existence. Of course, no one can predict the outcome of this war. The forces are incomparable, and the price Ukraine has already paid for this civilizational choice is enormous. But it is solely up to the Ukrainians that this price has not been paid in vain.